Welcome to our resource library and the archived presentation of Coverage Requirements Discovery, or CRD, Implementation Guide Requirements and Minimum Scope Breakdown, a Trebuchet presentation. This presentation provides information to inform a payer organization doing a minimum scope implementation of the Vinci CRD IG for pilot purposes. Using CRD increases transparency between payers and providers. This information is intended to help payer organizations understand how to get started with the CRD IG and join or start a pilot with the goal of achieving success in piloting and ultimately being compliant with the IG in production. This information is being presented by Scott Rossignol of eHealth Exchange. Scott is a co-lead of the Vinci Project Trebuchet. This information was developed by Scott in collaboration with members of the Project Trebuchet core team and with input from Project Trebuchet members. We appreciate Scott sharing his expertise in this presentation. This presentation and all Vinci presentations are offered under the HL7 antitrust policy to ensure appropriate collaboration and information sharing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Rossignol with the eHealth Exchange. I am a leader of the Vinci Trebuchet project and here today to talk to you about the Coverage Requirements Discovery Implementation Guide, the requirements for that implementation guide, and a minimum scope to help you get to a pilot as fast as possible. This presentation is intended for payer organizations as it deals with the CRD requirements from the payer's perspective. All right, with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. I think this presentation will take about 45 minutes. First, we're going to start with a review of the CRD requirements. We're going to look at different topics within the CRD implementation guides that are really critical for implementation. We're going to talk about how those are required in the implementation guides. Then we're going to talk about what scope really means for a payer when it comes to deploying CRD. What is the true requirement for scope? And why do you need to meet certain objectives? Is there a regulatory requirement? Is it a nice to have, etc.? Finally, we'll jump into that pilot scope discussion and what it really means to get started with CRD rather than completely complying with everything in the IGs. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. Here are a couple of key questions that we're going to discuss during the presentation. What you're seeing on the screen is an overview of how we see CRD deployed within a payer environment. Now, there's a lot of complexity to payer environments, and so this isn't going to be completely accurate. But the questions that you're seeing on the screen are really core to how we identify a minimum scope for this implementation guide. So looking from left to right here, we have the CDS hooks concept. What data do you expect to receive via FHIR when you receive a CDS hook? Or do you need to make FHIR queries as a result of that CDS hook to obtain additional information? Secondly, how will you secure entry into your network for these different concepts? From endpoint lookup through CDS hooks, these are all network queries into your network that need to be authenticated or could be unsecured. You'll need to make those determinations to proceed with a pilot. There are a lot of different CDS hooks out there and a lot of different response types, so it'll be important to understand what you want to support from the pilot perspective and what the implementation guide requires for production use. Finally, you need to think more about what systems must be integrated in your backend in the payer network. It's important to understand what data you require in order to respond to CRD and how that data is currently derived or stored in your system, so that you can hook everything up properly and get a CRD service running. All right, let's talk a little bit about endpoints and endpoints discovery. Endpoint discovery is a concept within the Vinci HREX guide, but CRD relies heavily upon this concept. The Vinci configuration endpoint is a tool that payers can use to make available all of the URLs that they use for Da Vinci implementation guides. Payers can do this through a single location, which allows providers through an X12271 to obtain this URL and then identify additional URLs like your CRD hook endpoint, your DTR and PAS endpoints, and other endpoints through a single query. This can be really valuable for the provider, for payers, and for other parties in the network. And it's a great idea to think about how you're going to deploy this and make it available pretty quickly if you are interested in CRD, DTR, and PAS, because it allows others to discover how to get access into your network, and it takes some burden off of your organization. Moving on, CRD security is a key topic here. Now, security itself is going to be really dependent on how your organization treats certain security requirements and how you might want to deploy this in production. It's really going to depend on your security team's processes and requirements. But for a pilot, there's a lot of different things to consider in terms of what you must secure, what you don't need to secure, and what the best idea to move forward fastest is. So in the Da Vinci implementation guides, there are recommendations around how to secure your endpoints and what to secure. The Da Vinci implementation guide does not recommend securing the Da Vinci configuration endpoint because this is an informational endpoint. It provides details around how to connect to your services, and it doesn't really expose any information that might be considered sensitive. CDS discovery and hook endpoints are recommended to be secured behind an OAuth 2 access token or another security mechanism. The Da Vinci implementation guides rely on certain requirements within downstream implementation guides as well. So CDS hooks actually has a full security mechanism in place where the client is producing an OAuth 2 client access token using the client credentials grant flow with the CRD server. There's a lot more detail in those guides that you can talk through, but the recommended security model is really quite extensive for CDS hooks. In production, that's necessary in order to defer any attacks or to keep safe. But in a non-production environment, it's not necessarily required. So it's important to understand what security you need given your pilot and the pilot scope. There's a concept of whitelisting as well within the implementation guides. Whitelisting means specifically stating that a given URL or IP address can access your system. This is a great concept to enable early on for security purposes because it's pretty simple to do. It's hard to maintain at scale though, so that's something you need to consider as you're thinking about operating this service with hundreds of providers. URL whitelisting with that many users or providers and having to add new URLs all the time might be really burdensome for your organization. Finally, it's important to understand what your current security capabilities are and how you deploy those. I recommend starting from your current security capabilities anytime you're thinking about a quick pilot. All right, let's talk a little bit about CDS hooks. So the implementation guide for CRD is really a CDS hook. The implementation guide uses CDS hooks to start the query from the provider to the payer and to respond back to the provider with information about the coverage for that patient and that procedure. So the CDS hook is really core to the CRD implementation guide. Now, CDS hooks are able to provide information to the payer as part of the initiation process. So there's this concept called a prefetch inside of the CDS hook that includes FHIR data. And the way that I refer to that FHIR data is whether that data is highly contextual to the CDS hook and to the process, or it contains low context. A low context hook might be something that says, hey, we have this patient with this coverage, and we have this potential procedure or CPT code that we're looking for prior auth on. That doesn't have a lot of detail that a payer might require today for prior authorization. You might require a place of service. You might require a performing provider, dates and times, or just dates. So the lack of context in a CDS hook like that might lead you to believe that you can't respond or that you need to go request more information before responding. Now, the higher context CDS hooks should contain all that information. So it's important to understand that you might be required to support both high context and low context hooks. And what decisions you make are going to actually drive what data you receive initially with the CDS hook. Just to paint this picture a little further, the appointment book hook is one that can be used to obtain prior authorization for the appointment that's being scheduled, the actual procedure appointment. This usually provides all the relevant contextual details because we know that that appointment's being scheduled at a certain date and time. We know that the provider it's going to be scheduled with, and we probably have that CPT code or other code for that procedure. So an appointment book hook can be very high context. A medium context hook is something like order dispatch. Order dispatch can be used sometime after the order is placed. It should include details about the order itself. It might include details about the order's performer and location, but that's not necessarily true. A low encounter hook is something like encounter start. I'm sorry, a low context hook is something like encounter start. A low context hook is used primarily to retrieve data in advance of a prior authorization. So it's important to understand that you can use low context hooks to obtain data before the prior authorization request actually comes in the door, so that you may be able to respond faster and perform some of the work in advance during that appointment. The encounter hook start gives you all that detail at the start or the check-in of that encounter. So that can be really useful because it gives you this point in time where you know you might have to do something afterwards. Okay, so CDS prefetches and FHIR queries are really how we break down how a payer obtains data. So the CDS prefetch is a piece of, it's a part of the CDS hook that you receive. The CDS prefetch provides you those FHIR resources at the time of the CDS hook's triggering. It can be used to completely calculate a response. You might not need additional data, but in a lot of circumstances, you're actually going to need to make FHIR queries in order to obtain all of the data that you need to respond to that CDS hook. The reason that these prefetches are typically not comprehensive is, one, the FHIR data might not be referenceable to the degree that you need. If you're getting a practitioner resource, you might not also get the practitioner role resource, and you might need that practitioner role resource to understand the specialty of the provider or some other piece of information that's only in that practitioner role FHIR resource. So you might need to make a FHIR query using that practitioner's ID to obtain the practitioner role resource. That's just one example. There are other examples where you might just not want to have a prefetch that is really, really large or contains a lot of different procedure results, like lab results. So you might want to make a FHIR query subsequently to get that data instead. What we're seeing in the industry today with the pilot work that we're doing is that most CRD solutions will require both of these methods. So it's important that you actually plan for CDS prefetch and FHIR queries as part of your pilot work. All right, so we've made our CDS hook call. We've gotten all the data. We've passed that data to our downstream systems to make our CRD determination. And now it's time to respond to that hook. The hook response is what goes back to the provider. The CRD implementation guide has a few required response types. These response types are the things that we think are most important for providers to be able to perform the different workflows in their system, right? Because the CRD response is really about the provider's experience interacting with your CRD endpoint. The required types are coverage information, the external reference, and instructions. There are a lot of other response types. I think what's really core about this CRD response is the coverage information. The coverage information response type is what puts information back into the provider system to indicate that a given procedure or a service request FHIR resource or medication request or nutrition request or device request, technically. But regardless, the coverage information response puts the prior authorization response data back in the provider's system. it uses this concept called a system action that tells the EHR, hey, here's some extra data to update your database with associated with this service request. And so the provider actually obtains the prior authorization number or any additional detail that you're writing back using this coverage information response type. So that response type is really important. It's something that you should start with. If you're going to only support one response type for a pilot, we certainly recommend the coverage information one. I think it's also important to understand that CRD responses can actually be configured by the CRD request. So a CDS hook can actually contain some configuration in this configuration options extension, and it can request a certain response type. This is that configurability of the EHR's workflows that I mentioned before. So an EHR or a provider can be opinionated about how they want to consume your prior auth response information, your CRD responses. I think this optionality in the workflow is great from a provider workflow perspective, but it makes it hard to understand what you must support in terms of CRD responses. So there's sort of a series of logic that you can go through, and that the provider can go through to understand which responses exist in your system, and then which responses the provider can consume and determine what the best option is. This is kind of complicated for a pilot. It's not necessary for you to pilot every response type or for you really to pilot the perfect workflow inside the EHR. If you do want to make sure that the EHR is set up and configured for your needs when you're piloting with a given provider, it's important just to talk to them and make sure that you understand which response types they want to receive. But otherwise, go with that coverage information response type as the first step. This is that coverage and configuration options concept that I just mentioned in the previous slide. CRD configuration options are a concept within the discovery endpoint for CRD. The discovery endpoint indicates what CDS hook cards and response types are supported. So you're allowed to say, hey, we only support this one response type, or here are the 4 response types that we as a payer support. The organization that is making the CDS hook is responsible for checking the Vinci CRD.configuration endpoint to ensure that the EHR is making a request for a response type that conforms to your configuration options. So if an EHR makes a request that you can't actually respond to because it's asking for a response option that you can't support, that is the fault of the EHR. And it's something that you'd have to work out operationally to get back on the same page. All right. Moving on here, CRD actually defines certain FHIR profiles that actually add functionality into the core FHIR resources that are used in this process. FHIR profiles are implementations of a FHIR resource. They're variations of how that FHIR resource should be or must be supported. I want to call out here the coverage information extension. This slice, which is an object inside of an array, allows for that configuration response type. I'm sorry, let's go back, the coverage information response type. So the coverage information slice writes coverage information back to the EHR via FHIR. It's important to call this one out because this is an extension to the FHIR resource. It's not common or standard inside of the FHIR resources today, so this is an addition. If your organization is validating FHIR resources, either when you create them or consume them, what that validation does is it checks to see that that FHIR resource is conformant to a FHIR profile. That's why these profiles exist, so that you actually have to download these new FHIR profiles for Vinci CRD and ensure that they are active in your system, so that if your system is checking to see conformance of a given resource, that it does respect these differences. The main one, again, being that coverage information extension, but there are some additional changes to the resources that you can see on the screen. These are all sort of not example changes, but some examples of changes that are in these profiles. Okay, We've talked about the functionalities already. So what we've talked about is the actual CRD process, pretty much end to end. One of the other core concepts within CRD and within the CMS 57 rule is performance requirements and reporting. So when we're thinking about prior authorization and CRD in particular, there are a number of requirements that fall kind of outside of the CRD process and more about how quickly that process is performed and how we're required to expose data to the public about our processes. Within the CRD implementation guide, there is a requirement, a shall statement, saying that your service will respond within 5 to 10 seconds 90% of the time. And there's a differentiation between that 5 and 10 seconds. So these CRD requests are supposed to be very snappy. They're supposed to be fast. And that's why there are these concepts of, the low context hooks to pre-populate your system. So that's one key topic here. And it's a source of a lot of concern for implementers. How do we get to a point where we're able to respond this quickly? The CMS 57 rule also has certain reporting requirements. These are broader than the CRD service, right? They don't actually include CRD specifics. They're more about prior authorization, the denial reasons, timeframes for prior authorization, and some other metrics. So I just wanted to make sure that we're talking about these performance requirements and reporting to help kind of fill in the full picture about CRD and about prior authorization in general. Okay, so we spent the last 20-ish minutes talking about CRD and the core scope, the requirements in the implementation guide for CRD. Now we're going to take this a step back and say, what is actually important to get to a pilot? What do you actually have to comply with to be able to pilot this software, as opposed to being fully compliant with the IG? Now, we do recommend full compliance with the IG for production software. So come January of 2027, we are still recommending that you're fully compliant with the IG. But before then, it's important that you're piloting the software as fast as possible, that you're piloting certain functions that are your highest risk, or that have the largest number of questions that you need to work through. And because of that, what we want to help you understand is that minimum scope, that path to getting to a pilot, and what it really means for you so that you can move a little quicker. So where I want to start with that discussion is what's outside of the implementation guide in terms of scope and what's really driving our need as an industry to adopt CRD outside of the implementation guide. The simple answer here is the CMS 57 rule is doing that. A lot of you have already analyzed the CMS 57 rule and you understand what it requires, what it does not require. And so I want to just paint that picture quickly in case you need to get caught up. The CMS 57 rule recommends, it does not require conformance with CRD, DTR, and PAS implementation guides. So right off the bat, what we're saying here is that conformance with the CRD IG is not required by CMS 57. So if it comes down to it, and you need to support CRD, you don't actually have to support every shall and must in the CRD IG. You do need to support it to a level that's usable, though, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we make that balance. A couple of other topics here. The CMS 57 rule does not require or include anything about SSRA or dynamic client registration. This is a security concept which allows an organization like a provider to register themselves with your servers so that when they contact you and perform a prior authorization, that your servers know who they are. This is an important concept because it automates something that otherwise might take days or weeks to perform from the operational standpoint. If anyone that's listening to this has ever set up a FHIR app or an integration between one organization and another, you'll remember that it actually takes quite a long time to get people to just click these buttons to allow the application into their environment. There are, of course, a number of steps or setup steps, as well as operational approvals that have to go into that. What dynamic client registration does is it automates that process, which is really nice, but it's not in scope for the CMS 57 rule. The CMS 57 rule also does not implement specific CRD response time requirements. So when we talked about those 5 and 10-second response times, it's important to understand that the CMS 57 rule does not require them. Finally, one of the things about this rule that kind of creates a lot of codependencies within the payer network and really helps us understand how to move forward with burden reduction or prior authorization workflows is that the CMS 57 rule does require that you enable FHIR capabilities, right? So you must have FHIR API capabilities meeting the patient access, provider directory, and payer-to-payer APIs. These are all FHIR-based services. And so in the future, your organization is going to be communicating using FHIR. So the CRD implementation guide uses FHIR as its core to provide information to you. What that means is that you're already required to use FHIR for all these other purposes. It really makes sense to use FHIR for prior authorization and CRD, and it's actually required to use FHIR for CRD, or for prior authorization in general, as well. So it's not required that you use CRD, but it is required that you use FHIR for this process. And I think at the end of the day, what that means is that the CRD implementation guide is the best option for you to move forward with prior authorization, because it's the industry's best effort to make this as simple as possible, despite all the complexities that we already talked about. Right. Some of the other reasons that the CRD implementation guide can add value to your ecosystem as a payer are on the screen here. So those other CMS 57 requirements, like I mentioned, they're driven by FHIR. But the CRD process itself actually interacts with those other implementation guides in ways that's not really documented or that you can't see until you really start working through each individual implementation guide. So the top one, member attribution, is a concept where payers have an attribution mechanism saying this person, this member or patient is associated with this provider or NPI. CRD is an indication of a treatment relationship. CRD is the process of saying this patient needs this procedure performed by this provider, a treatment relationship. And so you can actually use CRD to drive some of your member attribution processes, which allows kind of an ecosystem where you are actually making use of that CRD, that prior authorization, to help downstream with other processes. CRD can also be a trigger for you to collect data about a patient. If you don't have information about this person's history, you could use a CRD request as a mechanism to go get information via what's called CDEX or Clinical Data Exchange. If you need to perform risk adjustment processes, quality measurement, or something else regarding a patient, CRD is a good opportunity for you to do that if you don't have the information already. So it's a good opportunity for you to go get that data about that patient from the provider because you know that that patient's being seen by that provider. So you have a good opportunity and a good triggering mechanism to go get that data. Finally, provider access could be used, could also be a kind of a similar approach from the provider perspective. When the provider gets back a CRD response from a payer, that is an indication that that patient is a covered member of that payer or that payer's plan. Provider can use that indication to go get data from the payer and use the provider access API as a trigger to do that, or the trigger to use the provider access API to obtain that data. There are a lot of other kind of interdependencies between these implementation guides, but these are some of the highest level ones, showing why use of these implementation guides can benefit each other and can benefit the ecosystem as a whole. Okay. So what is minimum scope versus IG requirement? When we're thinking about minimum scope, what we're talking about is how do we get things done without actually being fully compliant with the IG? So starting off, you have to comply with all the shalls and musts in an IG to be fully compliant. And as I mentioned before, CMS 57 doesn't require strict IG compliance. So there's a tightrope we have to walk here if we're not going to be strictly compliant, because we need to be functional as a system. There's no reason to support CRD if your CRD system is unusable by the provider. Strict IG compliance is the best option to do that, but this is why we're talking about this minimum scope concept, so that you have something to work towards before strict IG compliance. The Da Vinci burden reduction approach, as mentioned before, is the best option for supporting prior authorization in the future. This is the way that everyone else is going to be doing it. It doesn't make sense for you to build your own system, to create your own standards and specifications, because nobody else is going to support those. It's just going to create long-term technical debt for you. So because burden reduction is the logical approach, because CMS 57 language doesn't really require strict compliance, what's the best approach to get started? Here it is. This slide really consolidates our recommendations on a pilot scope. And so if you're going to take anything away, this is the slide to look at. What we recommend for a pilot to get started with CRD, if you have not yet, is to look at that limited security and to look at existing security capabilities. If this work is non-production, I don't know that you need a lot of security in place. IP whitelisting might be all you want to make sure that nobody's DDoSing your servers, right? So there's certain considerations here, but for non-production work without PHI, try and eliminate as much security work as possible, because security work can be done on the back end. It can be done in preparation for a production go live, and it gets in the way of pilot work, especially if you want to expand your pilot and bring in new pilot testing partners fast. From the CDS hook standpoint, we recommend choosing the order sign hook. The order sign hook is a low context hook. It provides the payer information about the order at the time of signature. The reason we recommend selecting this hook as a starting point is because your organization needs to understand how to produce a prior auth response without a lot of information. Look, I actually kind of outlined those pieces of information that might be missing on a later slide, so hang tight for that. So you could take the opposite approach here, and you could go with a high context hook if you want to get started with an easy hook. But we don't have a strong problem with that or anything. But at the same time, it might be best to start your pilot work with one of the harder hooks so that you can work through those processes and that your downstream decisions don't get impacted by things that you decided during your pilot process. Great, so response type, I've already mentioned the coverage information. Response type is the best option for support. Additionally, we do recommend support for the CDS discovery endpoint. We recommend supporting the Da Vinci endpoint discovery concept because it's relatively easy to get set up. If you want to push this out of scope to a later phase, that is fine. A pilot does not require this, but it's nice to have a lot of your infrastructure and basic concepts set up, especially if they're pretty easy to deploy. The pertinent FHIR profiles are another piece to think about. We do recommend the service request as the most important FHIR profile to support. Device request is a secondary profile. The others don't get used that frequently. We'll also, at the Trebuchet group, we talk about these concepts and get help from each other. And so what we definitely recommend is if you're piloting work, please come to Trebuchet and let us help you get set up, find testing partners, and answer other questions as they come up. A couple things not to worry about in terms of your pilot. The performance requirements are things that you should monitor, but you don't have to worry about responding in 5 seconds. Not for the pilot, and maybe not even production initially as you're getting started. Dynamic client registration is not critical, and it's probably not something that you can support technically today anyway. The configuration details on your discovery endpoint are not that important either. What you should do is align with your pilot testing partners on the hook and response types that you'll use and leave it at that. Mutual TLS security isn't something we've talked about on this webinar, but it is a concept that's recommended within CDS hooks. We don't recommend using mutual TLS security at this time for the pilot, and I actually don't see it as that feasible in the production setting either. Okay, One other thing here that goes against the recommendations in the IG is that we don't recommend securing your discovery endpoint. Your discovery endpoint just tells organizations where to go to send a CDS hook. There's nothing about the data in that endpoint that should be secured or private. So we don't recommend securing your discovery endpoint initially because it just gets in the way again of people trying to move forward and be able to get tasks done quicker. This is that slide I was mentioning before, where we've done this work before. We've done CRD before. We've piloted it between providers and payers. So we've got some ideas around what concerns or questions a payer needs to answer internally as they're moving forward. So this is just a couple of those, but these are some of the most important ones. The first question that you need to answer is what internal business logic exists today to support a CRD response? How are you getting your coverage information about a given CPT code for a given plan? How are you getting your prior authorization requirements related to that CPT code? And how are you identifying any alternative recommended services for that CPT code if it's not covered or if those services are recommended beforehand? Understanding how you're getting that information, understanding how that information is going to flow into your CDS hook response or your CRD response is critical to the internal business logic that you'll deploy. FHIR data mapping is one of the harder topics for payers because FHIR tends to be pretty new to payers, and so it means a lot of new setup. FHIR data mapping is not about creating new data models for your existing infrastructure. The processes that you have deployed today, the servers and services and databases that you have, are going to continue to exist. You're not going to overhaul everything just to use FHIR for this purpose, or most likely not. So what FHIR data mapping means is how do you take in data from FHIR and make it part of your downstream services in a way that doesn't disrupt them? This really comes down to understanding how that FHIR data is actually derived in the EHR and what it means to your system. And it can't be done at just the FHIR data element level. You can't just look at a FHIR resource and say, okay, well, this name correlates to this value in my database. Because FHIR data is going to be different than how you're consuming that data today. And so what it really requires is looking at this FHIR data at the production level from an EHR, getting data samples for given patients and other processes or other data types, and really evaluating that information to ensure that the downstream flow makes sense and to perform any translation or reconfiguration of that data after you've received it. It also means that you might have to do the same thing on the outbound side. Thinking about the provider access API or the payer access API, if you're storing data in a non-FHIR standard for those purposes, you might have to kind of reconfigure that data or retranslate that data on the way out the door. Okay, the second bullet point's really that critical piece for the low context hooks. You most likely will see CDS hooks that do not have a performing provider, performing location, an indication of whether they're inpatient or outpatient, those start and end dates, and CPT codes. You might get a link code or a SNOMED code, or you might get a procedure description instead of a code at all. How are you going to respond to those things? You'll need to determine whether you need to issue a response asking for more information, whether you can make a FHIR API call to get more detail, or if you can actually provide a response that is contingent on certain details being entered in the future. So here we are, it's November 2024 as I'm giving this presentation. You've got about 2 years to get everything ready. I wanted to give you a quick look at how that might flow and if you're just getting started now. So if you're just getting started now, you're going to need some time to determine and deploy your core functionality requirements. Consider that to be about 4 months of work from the discovery and analysis, the creation of requirements, and then the actual development work. When you're ready for core functionality, when your core functionality is ready for testing, is when we recommend you start engaging with testing partners. These are not necessarily pilot partners. Testing partners can help you understand if your software is working properly without having to include a provider in the mix. We'll talk a little bit more about testing partners and how vendors can fill that space and help you succeed with a low lift and actually no cost. So once you've gotten your core functionality tested, you can use that synthetic data. There's synthetic data available to start your testing processes and those testing partners as well. Then you can actually get ready for more of a production pilot, right? I'm not sure that you want to pilot just the core functionality in a production environment. Maybe you only want to do it in the test environment to make sure everything's working and understand how the EHR really works with your processes. But production environments are really valuable for the data that they provide you. They give you an understanding of how the EHR is storing data and providing you data in a way that test data will never do. Synthetic data is always populated in the same ways. It always has values in certain fields, and it doesn't give you a good indication of the chaos that a production system could provide, right? So it's important to understand production data, but you might not need to test all of your functionalities right away in production because you might not actually have a way to do that without really disrupting user workflows. So once you've gotten your core functionality ready and you're doing some production work or non-production piloting of your workflows to iron out those happy path and other use cases, what you should expect is that you're going to iterate through different issues, solving problems, and kind of spending about 6 months going from that core functional pilot to a fully compliant deployment ready for production testing. A fully functional pilot is going to have all of the scope that you intend for production. And this should be a production pilot once it's ready. So by early or middle 2026, you need to have this up and running if you want to be ready for 1/1/27. Without that much time spent understanding how your services work and testing out the edges of their services, you're not going to have the polish that you need on 1/1/27 to really use this effectively. You're going to get stuck in processes where you have organizations onboarding to a system that has problems in it. Right, so looking at the timeline here, that means you got to get started now. You got to start thinking about how you're going to architect your system, and you got to start testing as soon as you can to understand where those edges are and how to overcome some of the challenges with data that you're going to see, because the timeline is not going to get any longer for you. We got to make sure that we're ready for production before 1/1/27, or else you're going to see a lot of chaos and have a lot of trouble initially in production. So looking at pilot processes and scoping, thinking about how to get started quickly, how to get into that first phase in 2025, start considering what functionalities you can pilot quickly. Are there certain CPT codes that make the most sense, for example? Then thinking about what will your pilot actually look like? Are there certain NPIs that you'd have to receive in your pilot data? Are there certain member IDs or plans that you'd have to receive in your pilot data? What does an actual test of your pilot system look like? And what variations can you pilot or test with your partners up front? The next question is what I've talked about before. Do you actually have to go to production for your initial testing, or can you do kind of a stepped process where you're testing things with a partner outside of production and still learning? And what are you going to learn from those tests? You need to really understand those details. We do recommend third-party testing versus a pilot with a provider. Providers are busy. They don't have a lot of time to spend testing with every single payer out there. And there are third parties out there that are willing to help you, especially within the Project Trebuchet at no cost, right? So they're getting value by being able to test their systems with your endpoints. You're getting value by being able to test your system with their system. It's a win-win, and that's why Trebuchet's got this great group of folks willing to help, because we want to make sure everybody's ready for the requirements in 2027. Finally, what does that pilot with a provider look like, and how do you do that one-to-one pilot between one provider and yourself? It's not going to be a comprehensive experience for users. So what does the user experience actually look like? Is there enough value add for you to pilot your software in production with a provider such that the provider actually, has a reduction in burden, that the users are not actually doing more work just to pilot your software? Okay. We do recommend leveraging vendors. I've talked enough about Project Trebuchet already, and the vendors there are there to help. Vendors can provide value in a few ways, and you don't need to purchase their software. So you don't need to join Project Trebuchet if you don't want to. You can still interact with a vendor. You can still do a lot of this stuff without purchasing their product. Vendors help you understand perspective on regulations and requirements. You as one organization have a set of opinions that you've developed over time with your legal team and other policy folks. But go learn from others in the industry. Make sure that everybody's aligned. This presentation was really about getting you perspective on these regulations and how you can move forward. So look for other content out there. Review case studies and other demonstrable evidence, right? Like vendors are the ones that are providing these case studies because they want to convince you that their product is the best. Those case studies can be very valuable for you to understand how functional processes work in production environments. They can help give you insight into the process itself, how other organizations have done these things, as sort of a side effect to the fact that the vendors are providing these just to sell their product. Vendors also can provide testing systems, and like I've mentioned before, it's a win-win to be able to use a vendor's test system and to improve your product and to allow them to improve theirs. At this point in time, as everyone's preparing for January of 2027, this is a great way to just continue moving the needle forward. And as mentioned before, the vendors in Project Trebuchet do not charge for test use of their products. So this is a great opportunity to see what products are out there, how can they help you, how do they work, and how do they work with your system. Okay, in terms of next steps, these are the quick call to action for you. Define your initial functional requirements. Look at your supported hooks, responses, and security. Define your CPT codes and scope, and think about CRD, but don't think about CRD alone. CRD, DTR, and PAS implementation guides all work together. And so you might seek to pilot CRD as an initial starting point, but you do need to be working on DTR and PAS as well. So how does that all work together? Right now, EHR vendors are not supporting CRD, DTR, and PAS. They're still working on getting that support rolled out. So in the meantime, consider looking at a Smart on FHIR application that can do this work. Those apps were easier to build and roll out compared to a large EHR. And so they actually have all the functionality you need to be able to test a provider's workflow process without interacting with an EHR directly. Finally, let's start looking for your testing and pilot partners. There are a lot of organizations out there that want to help you because it's going to help them as well. It's win-win, as I mentioned. So start thinking about how you can get help and how you can help other organizations at the same time. That's it. It was great talking with you all. Thank you.